Start. Welcome to everybody who's here. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Janine, you want to call the roll?
And just as a reminder to all who are in attendance, this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the county's YouTube page. Calling the roll, Judge Adrian.
Here.
Ms. Yarham.
Here.
Ms. Gibbons.
Here.
Mr. Cross. Mr. Cross is absent at the moment. Judge McClellan.
Here.
There is a quorum. And also like the record to reflect that council members Schlepper and Hauser are in attendance.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. Okay. I'm going to exercise executive privilege here and move public comment back a little bit. We have some time constraints. I understand that the folks from the Public Defender's Office who are going to make a presentation here today have some time imperatives. So I'm going to let them come forward and give their presentation first. So if you would do so, please.
Thank you. I want to for public defender here in Cuyahoga County. We brought our whole team, as you can see, because they honestly, I'm probably the least person to hear from because I don't we want to bring perspective both of and support staff that do the work, but also from all of the children, parents, and the perspective. Some cases, decades of representation. So, just real briefly, I wanted to introduce who's here, and then Brooke Corns, who's with the Ohio Public Defender. Perspective, so we thought it was important to have her here. But Sam Amato over here is our juvenile division supervisor, our youth and parent. We actually renamed our division the Youth and Parent Defense Division. I'm still getting used to it. So, so Sam's our supervisor. Kenyatta Johnson is our one of our social workers in our Youth and Parent Defense Division. Kira is our mitigation specialist. Sarah is one of our vertical defenders. Ashley is our deputy chief public defender. And Leah, who's sitting next to me, who's going to moderate the discussion, bring people up, is our community engagement attorney. And so I just wanted to let you know how our office is a little bit, how it's organized. We have 29 attorneys in our Youth and Parent Defense Division. We have 7 social workers and parent advocates. We also have investigators and paralegals that provide litigation support on our cases. Last year, we handled 1,472 juvenile delinquency cases, and we also handled 850 what we call parent representation cases. So cases in which parents are facing the possible temporary or permanent removal of their children. And I think one of the things that we've learned is the intersection of those two systems is really critical to sort of understand some of the things that drive some of the delinquency cases. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brooke to introduce herself, and then Leah is going to take over the moderating. So, Brooke?
I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to get around to say hello to everybody personally. Blame it on not my heart. Okay. Okay. Yes.
Hello, my name is Brooke Burns. Thank you for allowing me to participate virtually today, so I could make it. I appreciate it. So a little bit about the Youth Defense Department here at the Office of the Ohio Public Defender. We are kind of a one-stop shop for all things youth justice throughout this state for young people. So we represent folks in appeals and post-conviction. We see every single child that goes into the Ohio Department of Youth Services, but also the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. We have attorneys that do conditions of confinement work. We've also got a team that does trial work for youth. So if there are counties that maybe don't have a sufficient amount of people who can take appointments on a trial matter, maybe there's a conflict, or maybe they don't have a public defender office, or maybe there's a number of youth co-defendants, and so they need someone to conflict counsel, we can step in and assist with that. We also represent young people who are eligible for parole under Senate Bill 256. And then we engage with a lot of policy advocacy. We also are kind of a hub for training youth defense counsel throughout the state with an annual 2 to 3 day training in which we train about 200 attorneys on youth defense related issues. We do not cross over into parent representation, so we are solely delinquency or post-conviction representation.
With that, if we can go to the next slide. Let's see. Okay. Oh, I do? Okay. I can figure out how to use it. Okay.
Ain't technology.
Thank you. I know, right? It's like, let's see how many attorneys in the room does it take to figure out how to use a clicker? So thank you all for having us. We appreciate the opportunity just to provide our perspective as you all are putting together kind of what you've learned through this process and any recommendations to move forward. And we're hopeful that, leaving away today, that you all will have a little bit more of that kind of perspective from the client, the parent. And I know we don't have our young people here with us, so we're going to try to bring their voice in the best that we can. But I'm also hopeful that we can have more of a dialogue. So if you all have questions or thoughts as we're going through the slides, please just raise it. We can also, obviously take time for questions at the end, but we would hope to have more of a conversation with you all today. So I would just invite you to jump in where possible. I just wanted to briefly touch on, I know you all are well aware, but our young people are different from adults. And the reason that we put this as kind of like the marker for, all conversations is just that reminder as we move through the landscape that we have 2 different systems for a reason. We have 2 different statutory codes. And it's because we know that kids need different responses when they engage in offending behaviors, and we also know they have a tremendous capacity for change as well as the ability to just desist from those behaviors. So we want to make sure that we're recognizing that as we think about how the system responds to them. Oh, okay. So I'm going to pass this to Brooke to kick us off for this slide.
So the young people who are in our youth justice system have high and complex needs. And so if you look at the data on how many youth are on the mental health caseload at the deep end, so 74% of our young men, 100% of our young ladies, those numbers are telling. For some of those youth, it's the contribution of their mental health need that landed them into the system in the first place. For some of those young people, getting into the deep end of the system is the first time that they get to have a diagnosis. But we also know that incarceration is further traumatizing. So if you consider that, given especially kind of the state we are in right now with workforce being low and incarceration numbers being very high, youth who are spending more time in solitary or behind their doors with those high trauma complex needs are engaging in or experiencing more trauma, and it's kind of exacerbating those issues. And if you see those numbers, we see that a lot of youth who are detained are facing these issues and these problems. And some of the ways in which our interventions are pointed at those youth are actually increasing their mental health needs or increasing or exacerbating their symptoms.
So we raise this not to provide excuses for behaviors or harm that young people are committing in the community, but it's really rather a context to view what young people are coming to the attention of the system with, and why the behaviors that they might be showing out of anger or hopelessness or desperation might be really exacerbated in the community because they're dealing with a number of variables that young folks in the community who don't have these challenges are able to kind of navigate through. So I would like to ask Kenyatta to come up and just share. We can look at this data all day and, we know these numbers, but I want you all to just hear a little bit more about what this looks like in terms of the actual clients that we see, so that you can have a kind of a full picture of who these young people are with some of these background scenarios.
Good morning. And so the first young man I'm going to talk about was before the court for amenability to determine if that particular case should be remain in juvenile court. He was 17 years old. At birth, he had some minor complications with jaundice, but as he got older, when he was about 8 years old, his little sister was murdered. And as a result of that, his father went into a deep depression, had some mental health issues, started abusing substances, and the child ended up finding his father deceased in their home. After that, his mother remarried. There was domestic violence that was going on in the home, and there was some concerns that his basic needs were not being met. And so he was then placed in a residential facility. Also, as a small child, I'm sorry, I'm kind of backtracking a little bit, but as a small child, he also had high levels of lead, which impacted his brain development, and he was found to have a low IQ of only 70, so he had an IEP when he entered school. But because of all these things that were going on within his family, he was not going to school consistently, which meant he was not getting the intervention services that he needed. He also had multiple mental health diagnoses from PTSD, ODD, ADHD, and he was also dealing with that there was community violence and violence in his home. He started eventually using substances himself and was sent for treatment. He did eventually, once he was able to get the mental health services in the detention center and the services through school, he actually graduated while he was in the detention center.
So I think just underscoring that when we see some of the behaviors that our young people are engaging with, and it just seems like they're erratic, they're impulsive, they just are behaving in ways that are really unsafe, there's a lot behind what might be driving those behaviors. And once we get them into a setting where they're able to get some stability, consistent adults who are positive, starting to work on some of that mental health piece, they're able to not only stabilize, but start to thrive a little bit and achieve some goals. I mean, graduating from high school is huge for someone who had such a tremendous gap in the school system and, complex kind of learning needs. So,
Can I ask you a quick question before?
absolutely.
That presentation suggested a really severe set of cumulative disadvantages that young man faced. How representative is what you just presented to us of the overall caseload of people who are in the deep end of the system?
A lot of them have multiple mental health. Some of them will come in with learning disabilities, instability at home. The majority of them, I don't recall any of the children that I've interviewed with and worked with that have not been impacted by some type of community violence. They're being shot at, they're witnessing people murdered in the streets in their community. So, I mean, his was probably one of the more extreme cases, but I think overall, the children are dealing with very complex issues. It's not just one thing, it's a multitude of things that they're dealing with.
So the majority of the folks that we would see coming in, not the general population of the juvenile court, but at the upper end, the people who are likely to make the news, for instance, when you dig in, you're going to find this kind of multi-layered kind of process.
Yes.
I think, Judge, to your point, we do see with the research around traumatic experience for kids who have been in a locked detention facility, whether that's just for a short stay or a longer stay, so it could be a misdemeanor or low-level felony or high-level felony. 92% report one traumatic experience in their environment, but when you ask about multiple or chronic traumas, it's 84%. So this is not something that's kind of in a vacuum with the general population of kids who come to the court.
Thank you.
So, okay. One of the things that, we wanted to provide is some of what the youth voice is asking for from our stakeholders, from our leaders, how they want to be perceived and how they feel they need to be treated in order to kind of make it through what they've come to the attention of the court with. And so I think when we ask them over and over, they want to be treated like kids. They recognize that they've done some really harmful and, in some ways unforgivable things, but they still want to be seen as a child and not criminalized, and so that they can be provided interventions to address a lot of what they might have been acting out from, or even if it's not kind of a root cause of their offense, just to make sure that they can kind of get what they need in a system that's designed to serve them. So I think Kenyatta can share another example of a situation.
Well, the second individual that I'm going to speak about, this young man had never had any involvement with the court, and it was a mandatory transfer case, but he had been raised by his grandmother. Father was incarcerated. He had actually been a good student. He had gotten in one of the specialized magnet schools in Cleveland School District, but he just started making poor decisions and ended up using substances, running away from his grandmother's house. And, in asking him, he just thought that there was something better out in the community. He didn't want to follow the rules. So he ended up, not being able to finish school in the community. But while in the detention center, he was able to graduate school and was planning on starting college classes while still here. So he was able to, kind of start making better decisions while in the detention center with the support. He did also have some mental health diagnoses that he had, but had never received treatment. And in talking to another thing that I see with a lot of the kids is the parent support. In speaking with his grandmother who raised him, I'm asking her about his mental health, and she's like, well, he's never had mental health. He's never had mental health services, but it's documented in his paperwork that he does. And so that's another thing that I see with the kids, even with the complex issues. They don't have the support sometimes with the parents that they need. And so this young man ended up graduating from, like I said, graduating from high school. And also, same situation, was a victim and a witness to a lot of community violence.
And what was the offense that caused his case to be a mandatory binder?
It was a homicide.
The homicide.
Yes.
I want the record to reflect before we go any further that we've been joined by two other members of County Council, and I'd like them to identify themselves for the record. Thank you for joining us.
No, and one of the interventions, a young man that I'm working with now was actually able to previously, as part of his probation, go through the CBIC program where he received, therapy and has, now was able to start earning high school credit where he wasn't previously, is actually doing well in the detention center, continuing to earn high school credit. So that's one of the interventions programs that we see. He didn't miss any days in the program. It's a 10 to 12-week program.
Thanks, Kenyatta. So I think we just wanted to highlight kind of both ends of that spectrum, being able to get some of those targeted interventions and someone who has engaged in very high-risk behavior otherwise might be thrown away, they're still able to turn it around in a short period of time given some appropriate interventions. I'm not sure if you're able to short statement from a parent. I know to your point, we wanted to provide as much voice from apologize.
And while we're working on the audio for the video, I'd also like the record to reflect that Mr. Cross is in attendance.
Thank you. Thank you, Mara.
You all, if you want to listen to it, you have the PowerPoint, you can pull up her sound clip. But essentially, this mother her son was 15 when he was facing a bind over. He had previously been juvenile court involved, and she's sharing her perspective about kind of reaching out to multiple systems, including children's services, the juvenile court, much earlier on when her son started demonstrating some concerning behaviors, and she wasn't able to find anything to support him. And unfortunately, he ended up, committing an offense that was really serious and faced a discretionary bind over. We have his attorney, Sarah Honig, here just to provide a little bit more context. But, what we hear a lot from parents is that they reach out earlier on, and until things escalate, it seems like the only option that's available is incarceration in either the youth or adult system. And so that earlier on piece is really important for the families.
Yeah, thank you. And I wish you could hear this woman's words because they're her own, but, she's upset with the system for binding her child over, not just for binding her child over to the adult system when he was 15, but because his prior involvement with the system was her calling police and charging him basically with disorderly conduct because she felt it was a last resort. She'd been trying to get help for him. She saw him going down the wrong path, a bad path, and reached out and basically brought charges on him. He was found delinquent of disorderly conduct. He ended up in mental health court participating in CBIC and doing fairly well, but at his amenability hearing, the court pointed to, setbacks and, slip-ups that he would make while in these programs to find that he wasn't amenable to juvenile court rehabilitation. He was bound over at 15. He received a 6-year sentence in adult prison. Being 15 and getting 6-year sentence, that could have been served in DYS. He could have stayed in juvenile court because they have jurisdiction until you're 21. So he'll get out of adult prison when he's 21, which is really unfortunate because he's received little to no services and programming. He's been the victim of assaults, and he's now at one of the most restrictive and dangerous facilities in the state, which means when he gets out, when he's 21, he'll face even more trauma and seemingly insurmountable challenges from the adult prison system.
How old is he now?
He's 20 now.
His mother, in the statement, she really pointed to the fact that when she reached out to the court system and the stakeholders and she tried to explain what she was seeing and asking for help, those statements were then used against her son and against her in the court process. And so, you know, really trying to understand as a layperson who's not an attorney, how to feel like you can reach out and ask for a system to help when you're also worried about how that might be used against your family. And so I think bridging some of that trust building and making sure that we're responsive to families in a way that's actually supportive is one area that we could probably improve in from the parent's perspective.
It was a homicide offense. No, it was discretionary. He was 15. There was not a gun involved.
Kira, can you join and just share a little bit more from kind of the parent perspective? The reason we're highlighting this as well is just to show what we hear a lot of times from young people and their parents by the time they get to us and they're in some of these deeper end systems, some of the challenges on the front end that often go overlooked.
Hi, I'm Kira Mullen, and many of our clients have experienced, with their families or without their families, some form of homelessness before they find themselves in any sort of bind-over proceedings. And whether they've been without permanent housing alongside their families or in a situation by themselves, stable housing often has the strongest impact on educational and social service continuity for families. The type of homelessness our young clients experience is often overlooked. However, they find themselves on the street, on couches, or as extra members of other households in scenarios with questionable safety and supervision. So, you know, our children, I do mitigation with them. So basically I'm exploring their backgrounds to try to get this information that you're curious about and that we're curious about to see where they're coming from. They tell me about, they describe living in cars, under bridges, in abandoned warehouses, often in unrelated adult homes where there is often heightened risk of sexual abuse. Many of the delinquency cases we handle begin with the kids getting kicked out of their home. And the reason why they're getting kicked out of their home is sometimes domestic violence, sometimes disorderly discord, conflict. However, a lot of times the parent or the guardian or the caregiver just didn't feel like they could handle that anymore. They were overwhelmed. And sometimes this was after a great deal of effort, like Sarah was talking about. Sometimes it was only after a small incident, but they were overwhelmed, and that's the point. Whether or not whoever's fault it may be, it doesn't matter. They were overwhelmed, and it seemed like that was the only option because systems like the juvenile court, systems like DCFS, they seem opaque and complex and frankly punitive, which is what we are trying to see go in another direction so parents can actually ask for help before, quote unquote, kicking their kids out onto the streets, where youth homelessness often leads to crime. Yes, and so whether the child leaves voluntarily or involuntary often depends on factors completely out of their control. So parental stress, the mental health of everyone in the family, the success of other siblings, their needs, the needs of other siblings, the presence of others in their home, the ability of the family to endure setbacks, poverty. In March of 2023, which is the most recent I could find for today's discussion, although I do believe there might be some more updated statistics, the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention released a fact sheet addressing this kind of youth homelessness that's not necessarily in the shelters or counted. In their justice, these homeless kids' juvenile justice system involvement. Nationally, 4.2 million youth and young adults are estimated to experience homelessness each year. And of those, 57% of those are estimated to have prior contact with the juvenile court or DCFS, Department of Children and Family Services, or both. Even more recent estimates from last year suggest that 46% of youth who have experienced homelessness have been held in a juvenile detention center. That doesn't mean they've been adjudicated of anything. They've just been held there. They've been inside a detention center. At some point, as compared to 15% of the general population of children. So that's 57%, excuse me, 46% versus 15%. That's a huge disparity. And these demographics are 83% Black children, 33% Latino, and way, way, way too many LGBTQIA children to count. These are the most likely demographics to experience youth homelessness. Youth with limited or truncated education, who have not completed their high school or GED studies in a typical time frame, like on par with the children that they started kindergarten with, so their chronological peers, are 346% more likely than those that they started kindergarten with, their normal age peers, to experience homelessness, this type of homelessness that's not recorded. System-involved youth are at higher risk of experiencing this type of homelessness, and court orders like home detention monitors and probation terms. And these kinds of orders are implemented without taking into consideration the child's home life. They're more than likely to just send them back to a place that has already proven to be a conflictual environment that doesn't work for the child. And oftentimes these serve as barriers to housing, education, employment, and other factors that hopefully would strengthen a family or strengthen or promote self-sufficiency, but oftentimes can do the exact opposite when not taken into consideration. All these other factors can be completely counterintuitive. So the themes that you hear from us, all these, trauma indicators, can be seen in DCFS and the child welfare system and their staffings that they do with parents, as well as all the themes that I see when I do mitigation with our kids in the juvenile justice system who are being bound over. And that could be mental health, domestic violence, poverty, substance use, sexual abuse, incarcerated parents, absent parents, paternity establishment or lack thereof, family preservation, healthy parenting. All of these headings I could do for many, many, many of our children, if not all of them. And I would encourage you to ask questions about our clients. Specifically, I do have a few examples myself of homelessness, examples of a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old that I'd love to share at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
So I don't want to go with respect for time, I want to also make sure we have time for a conversation as well. So like I said, feel free to jump in, but I want you all to be aware that there are some things in here that we think just might be kind of context setting for some of the discussions that you've had. I know there's been a lot of conversation around firearms, youth with guns and access, and one of the things that we know to be true is that what youth are experiencing in their communities as far as safety and risks and witnessing violence lead to their interest or feeling that they need to carry for protection. So studies also confirm this in terms of like young people who are more motivated by fear versus any kind of a criminal intent. And when we look at the data, it backs that up. I mean, their fears are rational based on their victimization rates as well. So we just wanted to provide that context for you. And I want to just briefly touch on some of the things that you all have heard that we want to really kind of double tap on that we think are really important recommendations. We know that holding youth accountable in ways that work require a lens of what's appropriate for them developmentally and understanding how developmentally they will move through those phases. And so we've heard from, I think you all heard from Catalyzed Justice around some recommendations for best practices for gun violence. What you didn't hear was incarceration. But you heard things like individualized services that are intensive, CBT, MST. Those services are phenomenal, and that's what really helps to repair that family unit. The wraparound model using credible messengers and providing kids with incentives for that behavior change. But one of the big things I hope that will be a takeaway today is the sustained funding for things that build into the environmental risk factors. Because we're getting these kids coming to us with multiple needs that went unaddressed in the community, and then on the back end, we're paying to incarcerate them as the response. And if we can shift that funding to the front end to some of those best practices that you all have heard about, those pipelines of kids into us will start to dramatically reduce. So I think I just want to ask Brooke if you want to jump in here.
Can I
on
have
anything.
you
Yes,
move back one slide, please?
Judge.
I don't see what I was looking at. There was something that said that we appeared to be bucking the trend.
Oh, yes, sorry, I've skipped ahead of myself, but Brooke is
Okay.
going to cover that slide in just a second.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, so for the next slide
Oh.
with the kind of which way transfer is going. So across the country, we've actually seen a decrease in mandatory transfer, or states that have what's closest to our version of mandatory transfer or direct files. Most jurisdictions are actually right-sizing youth justice to transfer less children and instead retain them in the youth justice system, where they can take advantage of kind of treatment rehabilitation efforts. But we, as in the whole state of Ohio, are actually not doing that. We're kind of an outlier. And unfortunately, Cuyahoga County is one of the drivers of us being an outlier in those trends. Interestingly, data over the last 25 years has shown youth incarceration on a steady decline, significant and steady decline. And that has also fallen with arrest as well. So it's not as though because we're incarcerating, more kids, we have less arrest. It's actually that incarceration and arrest rates for young people and offending overall by young people is actually trending way down. And some of those data and statistics are there about youth arrest accounting for only 9% in 2022, fewer arrests between 2022 and 2019. And youth under 18 being responsible for less than 11% of non-fatal violent crime incidents. I will say, however, that youth being victimized has actually increased. In particular, youth who are victims of homicide has increased 45% between 2019 and 2022, which kind of goes hand in hand with this discussion about young people and carrying weapons. I believe the next slides are going to go more into a deep dive of what our bind over trends look like, but this just gives a picture of Ohio. So if you look at these data points here, you'll kind of see what I was talking about as far as Cuyahoga sort of leading the way with transfer. And that's not because Cuyahoga has more youth that are committing these types of offenses. It is just that how they're being handled and processed looks very different than some of our other larger municipalities.
You can see that increase starting in 2017, fiscal year 2017.
Are
Oh,
you
do
saying
have a
that the
question?
same number of indictments are occurring in each of these counties?
Well, it's interesting that you say indictments, because even how Cuyahoga tends to handle its case processing looks different than these other counties as well. For example, in Franklin County, let's say that a youth is charged with, let's say 4 aggravated robberies. Typically, that's going to be handled in one case, even if there are multiple counts. However, it is not uncommon for us to see a 12 case number indictment coming out of Cuyahoga for the same number of incidents. And so that is one of the differences between how Cuyahoga is handling its charging of youth offenses, even serious offenses, versus places like Franklin, Hamilton, Montgomery, and Summit.
Do we have a comparison between the number of charges and the nature of the offenses?
We could probably get that. My office has put together some bind over data that looks at what happens to kids post-transfer, and that slide is actually later in this presentation. We haven't disaggregated for number of types of offenses, but I can tell you that both what national data tells us and what the majority of our state data tells us, which you can collect from the Ohio Department of Youth Services, is that offending behaviors are similar among children. There's not like for lack of a better term, like a crime vortex in Cuyahoga that looks different than other places in the state. It's just how we handle those issues in youth justice looks very different geographically.
That's kind of different.
Amount of crimes being, I mean, the counties aren't, Marvin and I have talked about this before, the counties aren't the same, and there's different things happening in different counties. I want to compare apples to apples. I don't feel I have that.
And
Right.
when we talked to the
Well-
judges last month, they made the point that there really was no good way to compare Cuyahoga County vis-a-vis the rest of the large counties in the state. And so if there really is a good way to compare, we really need to see that.
So it's a matter of somebody actually has to do the legwork to put it together. So the Ohio Department of Youth Services, as I said, does put together data on various aspects, things that courts have to report to them. The one county that has actually seen an increase or spike in adolescent behavior or serious offenses has been Hamilton, but even their numbers have not reached the same level of Cuyahoga. And that's even with gun offenses. And so there are some pockets of data out there, but to really see apples to apples like you're asking, people would have to be employed that actually comb through all those different delinquency filings. And it's just not, that's something that doesn't currently exist right now.
Brooke, we did take a look at Hamilton, Franklin, and Cuyahoga County data because frequently there's sort of this one-dimensional number that we talk about when we're comparing counties, and that's number of felony adjudications. So, Cuyahoga County has 178 in fiscal year 2023 more felony youth adjudications than the next county being Franklin County. But we've always felt that was a little bit of a one-dimensional number. So we did do a public records request to Franklin County. We did a public records request to Hamilton. Unfortunately, Hamilton was not able to provide their statistics to us. What we did is wanted to look at serious violent offenses. So we were talking about like murder, aggravated robbery, rape, things of that nature, and found that there is a pretty significant disparity between number of individual youth charged with those higher level sometimes mandatory bind over offenses than Franklin or Hamilton. So like, for example, when we're talking about aggravated robbery, Cuyahoga County youth had 156 youth charged with aggravated robbery versus the 76 from the next county, Franklin. And based on charges in Hamilton, Hamilton wasn't quite even in the ballpark of even where Franklin was at. And the same going for murder when we were looking at 25 youth charged with murder in Franklin comparison to the 64 youth charged in Cuyahoga County. So while felony adjudications is sort of somewhat of a misleading number, because how we're going to handle a felony 5, low-level nonviolent offense versus, how the state requires courts to engage and proceed with murder, aggravated murder for kids 16 and over are going to look a little bit different. But, I do want to highlight the importance of much of what you all are talking about. And I don't want to get in your way, Brooke, from presenting the rest, but I do agree, we have to look at not these just singular buckets of data points, but we have to dig in deeper. And so we're happy to always continue to work with you all. And we have a data analytics team, so happy to do that. But to your point about young people being different, this is, I hope, the most important message here is that young people's brains, some of the youth serving systems look, you know, the examples you gave today, we're talking about, there were red flags at very early points in these young people's lives. And those red flags that may not have been addressed effectively or sufficiently led these young people into the youth justice system. And our focus is going to always be, all right, how do we move forward? How do we help young people in these child-serving agencies to get the help that they need so that they never come into contact, they never feel the need to hold a gun, and they're never engaged in a type of behavior that leads to another young person being harmed. So I thank you for so far. I'll be quiet now.
All right, I got to get this one in. So since we started this committee, you know, with my law enforcement experience and just looking at the different advocates that have been in here speaking about the different situations, and even when we met with the judges who were gracefully enough to get there, and we had these tough questions that they answered almost all of them before we could even ask them, it seems like we don't have enough programs. They got the program, but they don't have enough people to handle it. It seems like the funding, I remember when somebody was saying about the counselors. I can't remember everything, but I remember counselors, different fields where they said we just didn't have enough people to help. So you can have the best programs, but if we don't have enough funding or enough programs to help them, we're still gonna be spinning our wheels. And like the judge said, I know I'm pretty good about comparing all these different counties. You know, they're not gonna touch us when it comes to crime. I mean, I don't care what kind of stats you look at. You know, I've been in the streets, and I'm in the streets now, and I know, yeah, we got a big population, and our wraparound services, as you have said, we don't have enough. And so some kind of way, we got to get some kind of funding. We can fund everything across the world. We should be able to come up and try to figure out how to fund some of these programs that's going to really help kids. And I work in East Cleveland, volunteering, coaching, and you talking about some of the things that I sit here and listen to you saying, mental illness. I was the first coach to bring a mental health person to speak to the team, and they said it had never been done. So that's something that some kind of way, like I said, I'm not an expert on it. I guess we're gonna have to try to figure this out. And like I say, the judges, they eloquently said some of the things they wish wouldn't even come to them. But when you don't have the services that these people need, well, somebody was speaking about the homes that they used to put them in. We don't even have them anymore because people can't afford the insurance. They just don't have it, the availability. So until we can solve that, we can sit up and compare numbers in counties. You'll be comparing that to the cows come home.
And yes.
I think that's a really good point. And one thing I don't want to get lost in this discussion is it's not about one county's doing it great and another county's doing it poorly. I think that the way we look at it in our, right, and I think,
Suggesting is that there seems to be as if Cuyahoga is doing something different.
well, I think,
I don't think that's true.
well, I think we are seeing more cases bound over. And I think the question is,
But are
what,
you comparing what kind of cases are being bound over? Are you
Right.
comparing which judge you have? We had a judge several years ago who wouldn't bind anybody over.
right.
We've had other judges that bind everybody over. You gotta
I-
compare
I-
what you're talking about.
And Judge, what I'm trying to say is the way we look at it is every case that's bound over is a failure in the system. Like,
change the
and so,
legislation.
no, my point isn't that any one person is failing in the system. What I'm saying is, to echo some of the things that Bridget and Marvin mentioned, is there are these points in the system where we can intervene and make a difference in this kid's life. And the way I look at this subcommittee is identifying those points, those gaps, those places to fund, to make a difference so that we don't continue to see this pipeline. Whether Cuyahoga County has higher violent
Talking about before or after?
before.
It's like what Kenyatta's talking about.
Well, it could be,
Before the person ever gets to juvenile court, and she's 100% right.
So we have an opportunity,
We're here
not all
about the juvenile
bind overs.
court.
Yes.
So what are we supposed to do as a committee to recommend for the court to do within the powers of what county council can do? Everything comes back so far, everything I've heard for the last several months is funding. Funding, funding, or funding. That's been it. Because the programs, I can't believe the number of programs that the juvenile court has. Far more than the probation does at the adult court.
Right.
But they apparently need more funding.
We agree with that 100%. And you know, just one example is violence interrupters, incredible messengers who are, and that is something after the child gets involved in the system. And I know in speaking with our team, they would connect a kid with one of these individuals in every single case if we could. They're the people that are most likely to reach the kid and help. And in some cases, that case may get transferred anyway. But even if that's the case, even if that case gets transferred, they're going to have somebody in their life that's going to be helping them push them along a different and a more positive path. So I think you're right that it does come back to funding. I think there are funding opportunities once the kid gets involved in the justice system. But I also think it's important to think outside that, because I think just one example is our office has started a program called the FIRST program, where parents that have not yet had a DCFS filing but have been contacted by DCFS, and this is in collaboration with the county prosecutor and DCFS. We're working collaboratively. It gives them an opportunity to reach out to our office for services, for an attorney, to help them navigate these problems early on. And so we've seen great success in that in the parent representation realm. And some of the examples that were pointed out in the one case that Sarah talked about, it's parents reaching out. They know their kid is a potential problem. They need some help, but they don't get that help the way the system's set up until something serious happens, and at that point, sometimes it's too late. So anyway, I don't want to spend an excessive amount of time talking about bindovers, because that is a very small part of the cases that are in the juvenile justice system. It's an incredibly important part, and it's the most serious cases. But I think part of what I'm hoping that we'll all move towards is addressing all the kids that come into the justice system, just so that pipeline of kids that end up with the most serious cases goes down. And so that's...
It's been my experience over time, and not just as it relates to juvenile justice, but a whole lot of the justice system, that it becomes very difficult to get funding for prevention. Whereas prevention really is a place where you could probably do the most good. You know, once something has happened, damage has already been done. But this FIRST program that you're talking about is the kind of program that I would think would have a major impact if we look at the information that was given to us about the experience of the lady that unfortunately we couldn't hear from today, and the frustrations that she was suffering because of the fact that she couldn't get anybody to talk to her when things were still probably manageable. So, I mean, one of the things, hopefully, that we can hear from you about has to do with not just the FIRST program, but other instances where we can front load things as opposed to backload. My dad always used to tell me that a lawyer can do you a whole lot more good on the front end than he or she can do for you on the back end.
You want to give Brooke a chance?
So I think I want cruise through the rest of this, but I just want to acknowledge that not everything is black and white when it comes to the deep end cases. There is still an opportunity to intervene and provide that child an opportunity to get what they need in the system that's developmentally designed for them. So that's kind of our point here, is even with these deep end cases, we have opportunities. It's just about kind of shifting the culture about how we address them. There are differences in charging practices. I mean, we don't have all of that today, but we are doing things differently in Cuyahoga County. And I think our hope is that what we can show you is that there's discretion involved in how charging is done, how cases are sought, what we do with them, and those are the opportunities that we would like to kind of talk more about some of the recommendations, Judge, that you just mentioned. And the fiscal piece here is important because we're paying to process cases in a certain way. And if we can front load that and get kids in with an intervention that's designed for them, not only are we going to cut down what we're paying to process the case and on the back end, but we're also going to see the positives in public safety. And so our kind of purpose with some of these recommendations is to show that there's a financial component to what we're actually going to ask in terms of recommendations, that even in some of these deep end cases,
Mr. Chair, can I ask a question, Judge, about bindovers? As we know, most of us know that bindovers are governed by the state. We have a prosecutor that's separately elected that's choosing how to pursue those. We have judges in juvenile court who listen to the recommendations of whether or not a youth should be bound over. County council set up this committee with the understanding that we're not in that system. It's a separate branch that we do not have control over what the judges choose to do and the prosecutor. So with our subcommittee, this was more about, and I think we touched on it, with the resources that we can invest in before or possibly once the child gets in the system. So I'm just curious why we keep coming back to bindovers. We had a presentation from the judges at juvenile court to county council. We understand, all of us here. What's the point of continuing to talk about bindovers in this particular committee?
so I think in one respect, this slide here, cost to house youth in the detention center for the length of stay to process a bind over, when we see on the outcome side that 60% of those kids asking you to kind of take all of this in, and then when we get to our recommendation slide, understand that we're shifting where there are discretion points, because they do exist, that we want to shift so that that funding is used in a way that's actually providing the kid an intervention that's going to lead. That's part of the reason. I mean, this whole presentation is not on bindovers, but we thought that it was relevant to show a few things that, while bindover's been discussed with you all, that have not been provided, and I think that context is important.
I'll let the committee proceed, but the county council is not going to be able to affect what the juvenile court does with its budget. We can't micromanage the court's budget. I just want to make that clear.
If I could, briefly, so part of the picture is by bringing down the deep end and essentially using as light a touch as necessary with the youth who are the lowest risk, that actually helps make space and room to be able to use more creative interventions with youth with higher needs. And so I think the context of why transfer is important is because, let's say we start at the front end of the system. If we increase our access to diversion, let's say, and we have more kids on the diversion caseload, we pour more funding into diversion opportunities, well, that allows more youth to be diverted, which then pulls down youth who are currently on probation that may be better served in diversion, and now allows us to focus our probation efforts on youth who are a little higher risk than our diversion kids, and so on and so forth down the system. So that if we are pulling more probation kids down to diversion, if we're then taking kids who we would have put into the Department of Youth Services, and instead, so our felony 3s, 4s, and 5s, and putting them on a probation caseload, that actually makes more space at the deep end facilities for the youth with higher needs, higher felony offenses. So I think that's part of where this ties in, and that's one of the recommendations is if we pour some resources into this front end of the system with low risk kids, low level offenses, that's going to allow this effect where we can then pull back some of the kids who have been in this deeper end and give them the services that they need that are actually more targeted and have more success than transfer, or for lower risk kids, incarceration. We can give kids the adequate amount of assistance that will help them and lower recidivism.
Are we doing diversion?
Yeah, so we, I think exactly what Brooke highlighted is something that we're in the process of. You know, we have a diversion center that diverts a significant number of young people that come into contact with the juvenile court back to more appropriate mental health services, substance abuse, community-based diversion programs. So we have, you know, I will say since the development of the Early Intervention Diversion Center, which Leah remembers quite well, that is something that we continuously look at and evaluate our effectiveness with that. And I do appreciate Brooke's point about reserving resources. If you really are diverting most kids, then you're trying to reduce probation caseload sizes. I would say right now, that is a place that our probation leadership, Sarah Pubens and her team, are working very closely on. That is something that we're not quite there on. Probation caseload sizes for juvenile court are in the upper 30s, which, you know, back when I first came into the court would have been a dream come true. But we know that when probation officers are dealing with the types of cases Leah and the rest of the team talked about, it requires your probation officers to be highly skilled, working shoulder to shoulder with families, community, Applewood centers, Ohio Guidestone, mental health providers. So you're looking more like a mentor to that young person, focused on positive youth development opportunities, and you should have a significantly smaller caseload size to do what these folks need to do. We definitely agree 100% with Brooke. You divert more kids, you have lower caseload sizes. You can put the attention these young people who are at highest risk are to avoiding future aggravated robberies, avoiding robberies when they are wrapped very tightly. So agree completely with Brooke on that. So.
I know Brooke has a conflict, so she might have to jump off, but I just want to acknowledge the direction that the court has moved in with centralizing diversion for the county, things like Project Calm, the grassroots partnerships. Those are all of the promising approaches, and we should continue to build into that. And I think the violence interrupters, the mentors, those pieces absolutely need to be thought of as a sustainable source of funded programming. But I think, you know, one of the things that we're asking of you today is to think about how we're shifting, how we've shifted towards on the front end. We're also asking for that same kind of a shift on the deep end, and really thinking about ways that we can invest in areas where perhaps our racial disparities are most profound. Those are the areas that cost us the most money to provide an intervention for a youth that are also providing the worst outcomes. So we're asking for you all to think about that kind of cost assessment in terms of what we can do to beef up funding for the interventions that we know work as alternatives, instead of continuing to just pour into those deep end systems and not getting the result on the end that we need. So that's where some of the recommendations come in, and hopefully the context of why we're asking for that, especially when we see outcomes that we're seeing, to keep those kids in the system that's designed for them. And I recognize what your limited authority is, but I think the more that you all can kind of craft that vision for what you hear as best practices, the easier it is for those of us who are working in that system to raise that. It will take a culture shift over time. And so while these things might not be in your direct authority to change, having that cultural understanding about what recommendations you do put out will be helpful in terms of trying to push in that system on a regular basis. And so we have taken a lot more of your time than we anticipated, so thank you so much. I apologize for the length of this, but you know, we're happy to answer any other questions or engage in a dialogue with you all further.
Well, one of the things that I'd like to ask you to do, and I've asked others to do, is I appreciate your recommendations. I understand that you appreciate what the limitations are on what we can do, but if you can ballpark for us some minimal dollar figures for programmatic thrusts. For instance, I know that Bridget has told us in the past that they could use some additional probation officers, just for instance. If there are other programs that you can identify that you think could use some additional funding to bring them up to an optimal level, that would be useful for us to take a look at. Okay.
Can I just add
Sure, Bridget.
to Leah and Cullen's point, a couple things that's new. I'm not sure you're aware of. The court was recently awarded funding from Ohio's competitive reclaim for 2 categories, credible messenger programming. So we'll be working with Clinton Lacey's CM3 to work with Project Lift as new credible messenger training and program. So I think that'll be a great opportunity. Of course, it's really just startup funding, so to sustain it and really push that out at the scale that we need to is probably a place we'll have to continue to explore. The other program that we were awarded was a partnership with the Cleveland Division of Police for piloting in the 1st and 5th districts pre-arrest diversion, which I think gets to your point about many of these young people have trauma. If a young person under the age of 12 is out at 3 in the morning, we've got a real flag here. And those are probably families in need of appropriate childcare and supervision, basic need issues. So really helping, we'll be working with what we're calling the PASS program. So it'll be a parent support specialist that'll work with those families from those districts. And usually when the court is awarded a competitive reclaim grant, we usually find a way to continue to sustain those efforts. But again, those are very small scale efforts, and we're going to pilot them. So it'll be police-led diversion in those 2 districts. And I think you're aware of, and many of you are aware of, the court is right in the process of the OJJDP, which is the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act for Continuums of Care grant, where we'll be doing resource mapping, gap analysis to work with all of our child-serving agencies that you talked about. We really need to work with youth-serving and child-serving agencies to identify flags way, way earlier upstream. If a kid is failing out of school, how do we support that young person versus refer to juvenile court? I know I've been on the receiving end of people being frustrated from the education system that we're not processing these kids into courtrooms, and we're trying to say, there's community-based services for that mom or that family. So I would invite a representative from your department to be part of that. We would need 1 liaison from the Public Defender's Office to work with us closely on that. So I would encourage that. And then the last one, you're talking about Deep End, and the state, or we were awarded through BJA alongside in partnership with the General Division. They have the VIP specialized docket. What we're going to do is create a Deep End specialized intervention with specially trained probation officers to carry cases of kids with guns that are really deep end that we believe we can keep in the community if they're wrapped appropriately. And our partners on that will be violence interrupters, Project Lift, trauma therapists, really helping many of the young people who've experienced trauma address the trauma versus, vilifying them and seeing them get pushed further. So those are just some initiatives I wanted to elevate, but I do agree we need to talk about resources and support. So thank you all for your thoughtful presentation. I do wish we could have heard the parent. So thanks, and you can feel free to forward that to us, and Laura will, or Janine will send it forward.
It was sent already.
Perfect.
It's in the PowerPoint.
I should have figured that from you, Janine.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate the
Yeah,
work the
thank you.
subcommittee is doing, so.
Okay. Yeah, Sam. Come on to the mic, so they can capture it.
Yeah, Judge McClellan raised a really good point about stats, and they're all over the place. ODYS keeps stats, the court has stats, we have stats, and none of them agree. So I hope that one of your recommendations is that we find some way to standardize how this information is logged in and disseminated. And,
That is across counties?
yes, statewide.
Statewide.
Would be. And the other thing, what Kenyatta and Kira talked about, that has to be brought to the court. And the attorneys are the gatekeepers for that. So these kids really need good attorneys, especially the bind-over kids. And the bind-over kids, it's not entirely a state thing. There is a whole bunch of discretion points in that, from the charging, from whether there's probable cause, from whether the child is amenable. Those are things that, why does one judge bind everybody over and the other judge doesn't? So it isn't just, well, that's a state thing, we can't talk about it. we can't do anything about it. There's a bunch of discussion points there, and it'd be helpful to have a discussion on that. And I just want to point out how important it is that these kids have very good representation, because the trauma they go through doesn't get reported to the court unless the attorney discovers it, looks for it, wants to find it, which our attorneys are trained to do. We have a very good training program, the Brooke's off, but Brooke does very nice programming for us that we have access to with the State Public Defender's Office. And I think that's just a critical point. That's my main focus, is give these kids the representation they need. When we bind them over, we've given up on them. And I don't want to see that. But I think to Colin's point, no kid should be, if a kid gets bound over, we're all at fault for that. And we all have a responsibility for that. And we can't just say, well, that's state legislative folks. We can't do anything about it.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm going to ask the members of the committee, we still have the people from CASA here? Yes. If you're willing and prepared to give us some additional time today, because this is an extraordinary session, I hope everybody can stay, hopefully. Okay, so we can hear from the people from CASA. Hearing no objection. I'll try and be quick. I want you to be thorough. Don't worry about quick.
Oh, the green button. Okay. Hello, everybody, members of the committee, Judge. Thank you for having us. My name is Nikita Stang, and I am the Community Outreach and Recruitment Coordinator at CASA of Cuyahoga County. I also have Hannah Wilshire. She's our Program Director. We are a small but mighty team here in Cuyahoga. We have 5 full-time staff and a couple of part-timers and an intern. We're a relatively new program as far as CASA programs go in the state of Ohio. So one of our goals is to grow. And I think this is a good sort of coming off that presentation, when you talk about violence interrupters, CASAs can play that role. They can be that support system for a child. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the program, history of child neglect. We do deal in some dual cases, but primarily we're dealing in dependency. Oop, clicked it on my computer, but not on the thing. So we're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about child welfare history, what that looks like here in Cuyahoga and nationally, who are our volunteers, requirements, and ways you can help. So Mary Ellen's story. So organized child welfare in the United States began with the New York Children's Aid Society, which was founded in 1853 to place orphan children in families. Child abuse didn't enter the national consciousness until Mary Ellen came along and was being neglected by her caregivers. And no one knew where to call, so they called the ASPCA. So in response, we finally got a federal foundation for child welfare. So this is probably not anything you don't all know, but we get about 7.5 million calls every year of child abuse and neglect. And nearly half of them have had some sort of traumatic event. And those people who are reporting are generally, first responders, teachers, CASAs. Okay, so here in Cuyahoga, the the program works a little bit different than it does in other counties. In some counties or in some states, the GAL, the guardian ad litem, and the CASA are sort of synonymous. But here, every child is required to have a GAL. I used to work at the CASA program in San Diego County in California, and we didn't have GALs. So this is all new to me. So our GALs, and for the most part, we have good relationships with them because we're volunteers and they're not, right? Excuse me, they're paid attorneys. So we are coming up on our 10-year anniversary here in Cuyahoga. I'll go through our stats in a second. But we're really here to serve every child through advocacy, education, and collaborative alliances. Okay, so CASA was started in the 70s in Seattle. There was a judge who recognized that he didn't have enough information to make the best recommendations for a child. And that's where CASA was born out of. We have nearly 1,000 programs and growing all the time across the country. And they're county specific. So here's a map of the current programs that we have in Ohio. I live up in Lake County. You can see we don't have a program, which is why I work here in Cuyahoga. But we're always looking to expand, but it comes down to funding. I mean, you couldn't have said it better, you know, it's just, we have a staff of 5. And if you look at the numbers of kids, so all of our volunteers have a volunteer coordinator that helps them with their case. And we have 4 of us. Do you still have 3? 3 of us? And so you can see there's 1,500 kids that could use an advocate. But our volunteer coordinators can't handle all of that. And yes, we're a nonprofit, but we have brick and mortar. You know, we need health insurance. We need salaries. And so our goal is to serve 1,000 children by the end of this year. We're at 875. And it really comes down to funding for us, is being able to hire more staff to oversee our volunteers. So who are our CASA volunteers? CASAs are everyday people. They're just like any of us. They're teachers, they're stay-at-home parents, some of them are attorneys, some of them are servers. It's just an adult who wants to care for a child and make a difference in a child's life. Okay, so what do CASAs do? Key components. Come on. So they investigate. We meet with and get to know the child and the family, or whoever the caregivers might be, and see what they look like in their natural environment, whether that's at school, at home, on the playground, but really just getting to know the child. Interview the child, depending on the age. Obviously, you can't interview a baby. Review all the records, all the court records, understand what's going on with the case, excuse me. We advocate, so our CASAs attend all the court hearings. And they advocate for the best interests of the child. Too often, what happens with children in dependency is no one asks the child what they want, right? And that's really what our CASAs do, is get to know the child and see it, what's going on firsthand. Because the guardian ad litem probably has a bazillion cases, the judge has a million cases, the social worker has a million cases, but the CASA has 1 or 2 cases. So the CASA is able to dedicate that time to that child. So we also help identify resources. So we're connected with a lot of community organizations. I'm actually on Wednesday going to pick up a coat from a place that's giving away free coats for my case kid. Again, they work with the GAL, the attorney, the social worker, to make sure that the child's actually getting the resources that they need, especially if the child has an IEP. Because as we know, that often goes unaddressed. And so the CASA can help facilitate that to happen. They monitor the case. Is it going anywhere? Are the parents following their case plan? They document all the activities that they do, and they remain involved on the case, which on average is about 2 years. We do not give legal advice. We don't make placement arrangements for the child. We don't give money. We don't take the child out places. We for safety reasons for the child and the CASA, we do not transport at all. And we don't socialize, we're not becoming friends with the family unless it's communicating about facilitating something for the child. And this is just sort of a summary of everything I've been talking about. We want to make sure that these kids aren't lingering in the system because it just happens too often. And so if they have an advocate, if they have someone who can speak up for them, studies have shown time and time again that the sooner we can get a CASA on a case, the more likely they are to have permanency. Whether that's back with the parents, the caregivers, in long-term foster placement, in a long-term, in a group home, but we want them to have a permanent place to live and not keep bouncing around through the system. So as I mentioned, CASAs take no more than 1 or 2 cases at a time. We have more frequent visits with the child for the first 6 months. It's twice a month, and then at least once a month after that. The volunteer can certainly meet with the child more than that, but we want to avoid burnout. So that's the minimum requirement. And then, as I mentioned, we have volunteer coordinators who are there to support our volunteers. So we're not just throwing them out to the wolves, because most people who decide to become CASAs have no background in child welfare. They don't know anything about foster care. So that supports a real critical part about what we do. I'll skip through. So we do take into account where our volunteers live, maybe what kind of case they're interested in. Not everybody wants a baby, and not everybody wants a teenager. And so we do take that into account. Other programs don't, but because we have a small program here in Cuyahoga, we're able to do that for our volunteers so that it's a good experience, because we do want them to stay. And we have many dedicated volunteers that that have been with us since day one. Okay, so you have to be 21. We do plenty of screening, background checks, references, an interview. We do 30 hours of training. Half of that's online, and half of that is in person, which we hold at the courthouse. And as I mentioned, 2 years commitment. Okay, how you can help. I think for the purposes of this presentation, I would just say we can help be the first step to stop kids from ending up in delinquency. Because if they have someone to advocate for them and to make sure that they're getting the services that they need, they're less likely to end up on the street, end up committing crimes. And so I would just say that would be our biggest ask. Also, just helping people understand what we do, because so many people don't know what CASA is. And our biggest way that we recruit volunteers is through word of mouth. So I would ask that if anyone mentions it, or if someone's looking for a volunteer role, they can hit us up. And we're over in University Circle, right by the clinic and case on Fair Hill Road. So, thank you. Questions?
Yeah, I have a couple.
Yeah.
So with regard to the children that you advocate for, what is the, thank you. What is the average period of time that a volunteer spends with a
With
child?
on the case. So we say about 10 to 12 hours a month. And that's not just with the child. That's also doing research, talking to professionals, reading through court documents. But again, it's that at least once a month or twice a month for the first 6 months.
And these cases are assigned by the court?
Correct. Or we sometimes get referrals. It might come from a social worker, from a teacher. Sometimes parents call us because they don't know what to do. But we are court appointed, so it has to come from the judge.
So if somebody called and said, we'd like for CASA to intervene in this particular case, you still have to go to the court to get assigned?
Correct.
All of the people that you are dealing with are court involved?
Yes.
And what is your relationship with the people who are serving as yes, thank you. GALs. Yeah.
Just like any other kind of relationship, it can vary. But for the most part, the CASA can reach out to the GAL just to get more information. The GAL, oftentimes the CASA will go on a home visit with the GAL, also with the social worker. But the CASA has access to all the same information that the court has.
So is an automatic connection between the CASA and the GAL, because both of those are court appointed, right?
Correct.
Okay, so when the court appoints the GAL.
We get the information about,
Information,
and the social worker and the judge and all that.
Okay. So then you make the connection between your office and their office, or vice versa?
Yes, so when we assign CASAs to cases, we have access to the court docket. So we look up who is the JL, and then we'll send an email and just make that connection. And then we'll have their information, the CASA is able to reach out to them as well.
Okay. And I think I saw something in the materials that suggested that there are certain kinds of cases that that CASA is probably predominantly involved with.
Yes, so we can actually be assigned to any type of abuse, neglect, dependency case from court order protective supervision all the way up to permanent custody. We're also on private custody cases where there are no GALs. Since the families can't afford a GAL, we do assign a CASA.
Okay. And did I see correctly that you have 80, there's a chair for you, by the way. That there are currently about 83 active people serving the CASA role currently?
Yes.
And did I also see correctly that there are approximately 1,500 outstanding cases that could benefit
That
from
could
CASA?
benefit from a CASA, yes, correct.
And each CASA is only handling about 2 people at any given point in time?
Yes, 1 or 2 cases.
Okay. And so I never was good at math, but that doesn't sound like coverage.
No.
So does that mean that there are times when you have to tell the judge, I'm sorry, but we're at saturation?
Yes, so there are times where we don't have enough CASAs and there are an influx of cases, and most of them come from judges or magistrates. They'll send me an email directly to request a case. But then it does flip-flop sometimes where we have not enough CASA too many CASAs and not enough referrals. So sometimes we won't have enough cases that come into our system. So we're always trying to find that even balance to get as many CASAs on cases and serve as many kids. But here in Cuyahoga, as we all know, there's so many children in custody. And that 1,500 is specifically kids who are involved with in-home supervision, court order protective supervision, or have been temporarily removed from their home who need a CASA.
Okay. I'm sorry. Anybody else have?
I had a question, actually, if I may, Chair.
Sure.
As someone who's adopted a child through the foster care system, my daughter had a CASA assigned to her, so I'm pretty familiar with the system. This is very near and dear to my heart. I had a question about educational interventions or educational organizations. For school-age children, kindergarten, even pre-K on up until, let's say, the age of 20 or 21 when they could potentially age out, what types of partnerships can your organization make? Are there partnerships in place? I used to live in Denver, Colorado, and I was a commissioner for crime prevention and control, and I worked with, diversionary programming for youth in the school district. And we were toying with a program, building it where teachers could also be CASAs, where, who better to put in place than a teacher that has had the appropriate background checks, fingerprinting, all those things. And it kind of built a double layer of permanency, because if it was a school-age child in their building, they could have that type of a partnership. So have you identified, or are there any ways to build better partnerships with educational entities throughout the county to potentially boost the number so that we have that coverage that the judge is speaking of?
Yeah, we definitely try. I mean, our CASAs have good relationships with teachers when they go into the schools. So CASAs will also, they're able to get the educational records, all of that. As trying to get partnerships, we've done presentations at like the Retired Teachers Association and things like that to try to get CASAs. And now that we have Nikita on board and she's our, recruitment and community outreach coordinator, she'll be doing that more and more. But it's just a matter of getting our foot in the door and setting up those meetings. Mm-hmm.
It's finding the gatekeepers to get us in those places.
Thank you for your presentation. I just want to clarify a couple things. It's true that guardian ad litems are mandated to go into schools, to talk to the kids, to do everything that you do as a parallel, correct?
So yes, they abide by Ohio Superintendent's Rule 48, which does give them authority to, of course, visit the child in the home and also at school, yes.
Well, not only authority, but by local rule, they're mandated. This is what they're required to
Sure.
do, and you are
Yes.
doing a parallel to that. So we already have GALs in place who are mandated to go to get the school records, to meet with the parents, to talk to the children. I heard you say that, you can ask the kids what they want, but so do the GALs, in fact, right? That's part of their
Sure.
role. So I don't want to have this committee think that somehow your role and what you're doing is different from that which the GAL is mandated to do. Because I heard you say, well, we ask what the kids want, so do GALs. GALs do these things. Your position is, well, there's only 2 assigned to a kid, and GALs are very busy, and we have more time. I think that's what your position is, and that's well taken. It's an enhancement to the GALs, correct?
Well, I would say we're an additional person who's able to work on the case because yes, GALs, they do have a specific rule that they have to follow, but they're not seeing the child as much as we are. We go twice a month for the first 6 months, and GALs don't have to do that. They just have to do, 1 placement or visit 1 time, per the Ohio superintendent's rule. So in 2016, we were brought on as that additional set because GALs, as I'm sure we know, have 60, 70 cases, and they're not able to spend as much time with the child and figure out exactly what resources they need and what what the family needs. So CASAs are that additional support to go in and say, okay, the same with the caseworker. I mean, they have 30 plus cases as well. So we're just an additional support, yes.
Correct.
Mhm.
Correct, I understand. And I want to make clear that you said GALs are paid, their attorneys know. You know what, and especially in private cases, GALs do not get paid what they put into this. And the courts also waive fees for GALs. When you said, we're brought in because there's the family can't afford a GAL, the court waives that. So I just want to be clear that, GALs are not paid 100% at attorney fees. In fact, they lose money all the time. Their workload is huge, it's volume. So I don't want that to get lost in this. The GALs do a yeoman's job in doing their work. And they don't get paid close to what they should get paid, especially in private cases when families can't afford it. They're still assigned on that case, and they still have to do their minimum, at least, requirements, which are, not insignificant. I just want to make those things clear. We appreciate your work. I'm not a GAL. I used to be in juvenile court, domestic court. I work with GALs, and I don't want their what they do day to day to get lost in this. And CASAs are an enhancement. So this committee has to decide what resources, where they need to go, So do we triple, is it going to be social worker, jail, and CASAs? Is it going to, so there's a lot of decision-making for the committee about where to put the resources strategically. And we need CASAs also. And we appreciate the volunteers from the community, and I will refer people to help with that to enhance your volunteers. It's significant role for people, especially looking for volunteer work and meaningful work. So I don't want to say that I don't appreciate what you're doing, but I also don't want to devalue GALs in this scheme of things.
Councilman, I don't think that I had the opportunity to make note of the fact that you are taking your time to be here, so if you would please just identify yourself for the record.
Sure. Robert Schlepper, councilman for District 6. Just thought I would stop today and see how everything was going to lay out. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Okay. Any other questions for the representative from CASA? Yes. Or
This is just not specifically for CASA, but once again, it seems like the more programs we get, the better off it is. And like I say, the judges and all the different advocates that have come in, some kind of way, we got to get these people funded. That's just we keep hearing it, but I just think if we can, I know we don't have but so much power, but you never know, by us talking about it, maybe some other people that do have the power might say, well, you know what, maybe we need to look at this a little different. And maybe they might pick them up that they might say, hey, this is something we really need to look at. And I know we don't have the power, but you never know who's listening to what we're saying, or who knows who that they might be talking to them, and they might give us some more funds. Not us, but when I say us, I'm talking about all of us in this together. They might be able to fund some of these groups.
Well, at the end of the day, it's always about the Benjamins, right? And so it's a scarcity of resources, and how do those resources get properly allocated? And I think that our major problem and concern and mission, should we choose to accept it, okay, is going to be to try to point the county council in the direction of where we think those dollars will be best spent. So, but I'm trying to find out from each one of the groups that comes forward, and I'm asking you, as I asked the public defender, if you had a reasonable wish list to make, provide that information to Janine, please, about what would be a rational and reasonable enhancement in, your funding, and we can take that into consideration as we're considering everybody else.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. We didn't do public comment, so I guess I'm going to ask at this juncture if there's anyone here for public comment.
No one signed in with me, Chair.
Okay. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes from the November 21st meeting with the judges?
Marvin, I'll make a motion that we accept.
Is there a second?
Second.
Properly moved and seconded that we approve the minutes from November 21st. Is there any unreadiness on the motion? Is there any unreadiness on the motion? Is there any unreadiness on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Under old business, Marvin Cross, we have been talking back and forth for some period of time about the fact that the folks over at the FBI would like to have an opportunity to talk with us. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, during some of our conversation, actually, I forgot, the judge that just left, she had brought up the point about, well, what are they doing about guns that are able to get into the community so easy. And I had spoke on about, I couldn't say anything because by me being in law enforcement and communicating with them, I knew there was some things going on. But I did talk to the agent in charge of the FBI, and he actually wants to come and do a presentation to us, because from the last time that we talked about it, there have been some significant actions that have happened that I think will even answer some of the judge's questions about some things that are going on. And so we just, whenever the committee has time, they were just going to come in and gracefully, we can get the FBI to come in and just actually do a presentation, a short one, on what they were doing.
Okay.
If
Is
the
that
committee
agreeable
so-
with everybody? We hear from folks from the FBI. So I would ask Janine if we can set that up, see if we can find a time. The other thing is, I think that we want to try to have, we're still shooting at trying to have all our business wrapped up by the end of first quarter, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I want to do. So I really am kind of bummed by the fact that we were not able to hear from the parent, and I still think that, I know, Bridget, you were talking about the possibility of us getting some input from the end consumer, as it were. And if we can do that, and if we can do this thing with the FBI, then I think that that would probably
Wrap us up.
wrap us
Yeah,
up.
I think we were doing frontline staff, so that'd be diversion, probation, mental health providers, just getting a handful that represent a good
Cross-section.
cross-section. And as far as family and youth, we wanted to maintain people's confidentiality, so we talked about either doing some type of survey or a small group with not a whole committee. So because young people who everything follows you. So we didn't want to have families and youth live streamed just to protect their privacy and things of that nature and the sensitive nature that they might be speaking. So we're talking with Janine and Laura on how to coordinate either a survey that can go out to help get that information, or a couple committee members in a closed-door subcommittee doing that and then feeding that information back to the larger committee as a whole.
I kind of am leaning towards the survey,
Okay.
although, I mean, it's good to have a couple of folks to do that, but really and truly, I think that it might be better if we do a survey and try to get the broadest kind of participation as we can. But of course, that means we have to draft the survey. So if we can do that, Laura, Janine, just kind of figure out what it is that we want to ask folks and try to get it out to as broad a group of individuals as possible, so that we can kind of get a feel for what is the community saying about what we're required to address. Because I think if we don't do that, then we are something less than authentic. Okay. And then with regard to first line folks, do you have some ideas to when we could get something together?
I think we probably need to give people like a 2-week notice because they're covering frontline shifts. So you're going to have to get, the actual supervision of the kids covered, but.
Why don't we kick that out a month and try to get the thing with regard to the FBI in about, within the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, but could we try to
Okay.
lock down both of those dates just so we can get that information out?
Yeah, because you guys are incredibly busy. I can't stand you. It's been amazing how hard it's been just to get all 5 of us in the same room. Okay.
Judge, I would say, Janine, I'll get up with you. I'll be able to talk to the agent in charge of the FBI. I'll call him tonight. But the other thing is, when we do the survey, if somebody wants to talk to somebody on the committee, I know I would be one that'd be willing to try to listen to them, because sometimes having a true person there, they see that somebody really cares, rather than sitting. I'm not saying that sending out a survey is not good, but I'm a people person. I sometimes like to look person in the eyes, and
Yeah.
you could tell if they BSing you or not, because, I tell them don't BS the BSer, so, because I grew up in the hood too, so, but they know what's genuine. You remember I told you that before. These young people think because they don't have a PhD or a master, and some people have PhDs and masters and think that they know. Nah, these kids know, these young people know when you full of it. So sometime, just being real, you got to look them in the eyes and let them know.
Why don't we make that an option on the survey? If you'd like to talk to somebody in real time, give us a call and we'll set it up. Okay. And
I volunteer judge.
That's right. Okay. Well, that sounds like a winner for me. Anything else? Okay. Any miscellaneous business that we need to be dealing with?
The ladies over there,
That we look good.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Properly moved and seconded that we adjourn. Any unreadiness? Any unreadiness? Any unreadiness? Hearing none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance and for your attention. And we will call back to order when we have something else to say.